Alright guys, we are going to go through our chapter 6.2 notes. This is just going through some more evidence of evolution, comparing different organisms and how scientists do that. So you should have a copy of your 6.2 notes, and if you're ready to begin, we will start. So the question is, does natural selection occur today? And evidence that we have indicates that the answer is yes. And we're actually going to be watching a video after our notes today that show how natural selection is currently occurring in the United States. So consider, for example, what happens when chemicals called pesticides are used to kill harmful insects such as cockroaches. Or think about like if you have to spray bees around your house, or if you know somebody that's a farmer and they put pesticides on their plants and gardens to help protect them. Right? When the pesticide is first used, it kills almost all the insects. But as time goes on, there are a few insects that have traits that protect them from the pesticide, and so those insects survive. Now, those surviving insects then are able to reproduce, and remember, they have those traits that help them stay protected, and some of those traits get passed or inherited to their offspring. So then the offspring continue to reproduce, and every time the pesticide is used, only the insects that survive are those that are resistant to the harmful effects of the pesticide. So those ones that have that trait that protect them. And as time goes on, the more insects that reproduce with that trait, the more insects are going to be resistant. So after many years, most of those cockroaches are going to be resistant to the pesticide, which means that the pesticide is no longer effective. And so new products have to be used to try and change what's effective and what those insects aren't resistant to. So since Darwin's time, scientists have found a great deal of evidence that supports this theory of evolution. Fossils are one thing, patterns of early development, so looking at how organisms develop when they're babies, and then similar body structures for organisms, how they're set up and their bones, all provide evidence that organisms have changed over time. So by examining fossils, scientists can infer the structures of the ancient organisms. And fossils show that in many cases, organisms that lived in the past were very different than organisms that were alive today. If you remember from the Bill Nye video earlier this week, it showed how, that giant sloth was huge, or the saber-toothed tiger had really, really big teeth. And we obviously don't have those animals today. They've gotten smaller, or they've become extinct, things like that. So scientists also make inferences about evolutionary relationships by comparing the early development of different organisms. So in early stages of development, so as organisms are growing when they're babies, before they're born, things like that, scientists have seen that organisms have a tail and a row of tiny slits along their throats. So these similarities suggest that these vertebrate animals or vertebrate species are related and share a common ancestor, or they start out in that same process or from that similar ancestor. So this kind of shows you they're different animals in their early development. Okay, so a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a pig, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. All very, very similar in very, very early development. Now, we do notice for most of these, or we should know as time goes on, for most of these, that tail will disappear. Those slits might turn into like arms and legs, or they will kind of get absorbed and turn into other features of the body. But they all have that similar feature in that tail. So scientists began to compare the body structures of living species to look for these clues. So the organism's body structure is its basic body plan. So how bones are arranged, what like structure it's set up as, and things like that. So fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals all have a similar body structure, which consists of an internal skeleton with a backbone. So all those animals have that backbone and that skeleton, and it's all laid out in a similar structure. So scientists then um, came up with the idea that all of these groups probably inherited that similar structure from an early vertebrate ancestor that they all shared and then developed from. So these similarities provide evidence that these organisms all evolved from a common ancestor, and those similar structures that related species have inherited from a common ancestor are what we call homologous structures. So that means they're similar structures. So as you can see, with the dolphin, the bird, and the dog, if we look at the bone structure, they all have a similar arrangement of bones. Even if the dolphin has a flipper, the bird has a wing, and the dog has a leg, they have specific forearm bones and then like joint bones and finger bones and things like that. They're all arranged in a similar structure. So today scientists also compare the DNA and protein sequences of different species to see how they are related. So using the combined evidence from DNA and the protein structures, looking at fossils and that early development and body structure, they can determine the evolutionary relationship among species and see which ones are closely related and which ones like maybe um, evolved from each other, things like that. So scientists infer that the species inherited many of the same genes from a common ancestor, and scientists have even begun to compare the genes of different species to determine how closely related they are. So by comparing the sequence of nitrogen bases in that DNA and seeing that pattern in how the genes are set up, scientists can infer how closely related they are. And the more similar DNA sequences that organisms have, that means the more closely related they are because they have more similar features and characteristics. So, in most cases, evidence from the DNA and protein structure has confirmed conclusions based on fossils, embryos, and body structure. However, though, scientists change their hypotheses about species relationships. And that is okay because they are testing it out. They're seeing if it's true or not. If it's not, they can go back and make changes and then test again. So, for example, there's an animal called a lesser panda, and scientists used to think that they were closely related to giant pandas because they're both supposed to be pandas. But as we look, scientists combined evidence of species relationships to draw what we call a branching tree. So, a branching tree is a diagram that shows how scientists think different groups of organisms are related. So, as you can see with this branching tree, the lesser panda and the giant panda actually aren't very similar, and a lesser panda is actually more closely related to a raccoon, whereas a giant panda is more closely related to a bear. So, with this, there's also the chance for new species to form when a group of individuals remain isolated from the rest of its species long enough to evolve different traits. And those traits then change what the organism is. So, isolation or complete separation occurs when some members of a species become cut off from the rest of the species. The group members may be separated by things such as a river, a volcano, or a mountain range. There could be some sort of natural disaster that separates them, um, or in our 6.1 notes how organisms were different on the different Galapagos Islands. They changed to their environment. So, Abert squirrels and the kebab squirrel are two kinds of squirrels that are separated by the Grand Canyon. The kebab and Abert squirrels belong to the same species, but they have slightly different characteristics, so they are different organisms. It's possible that one day Abert squirrel and the kebab squirrel will become so different from each other that they will actually be separate species. But as you can see, they have different coloring and different markings. So, because that Grand Canyon separated them, they had to adapt and make changes to their environment and where they lived. In the video later, we are going to see how that compares with rock pocket mice as well. Please make sure that you have your chapter 6.2 notes finished. If you need to go back in the video, please do that. Otherwise, you are good to go.